Welcome to Art Walkthrough, where I guide you through my creative process to help you become a better player at the game of art. This time around, we're tackling Team Dark. I had this sketch of Team Dark sitting on my iPad for years at this point, and so I decided with a day off from work, powered up the stream, and decided to give it a go and see where I could take it. And I think really my goal for this piece was to just work my rendering muscles a bit. It had been a while since I had actually just sat down and completed a painting from start to finish with a fully rendered look, and kind of really just push my rendering skills a bit and composition skills for this set of characters. So as always, I start off with a sketch, really just nailing the composition and the perspective, and then I begin to do a secondary line art pass on it, make sure that all my forms and perspective are in place properly, and really just get in those details now, because before I hadn't really actually been using any reference for the characters, but now I have reference pulled up for the characters and make sure they look appropriate, make sure they look that they're on model and on design. Yeah, the line art phase is really important, because this is where if you can nail this part down, you're gonna have a lot less problems in the future. And you'll see that I didn't spend as much time as I should have in the line art phase, as is normal for my bad habits that I have. And it ends up biting me a little bit, but that's all right, because we can always create new stuff as we go. Now what I'm doing is I'm going to create silhouettes from the characters and basically hand draw an outline around every character, basically creating a selection out of the shape that I created and then masking it to a group layer folder and then doing all my painting inside of it. And now what I'm doing is I'm creating what's called a shadow map, which is basically just a cel-shaded version of where the lighting is coming from. So that way the lighting is set up and I'm not guessing where the lighting is coming from. And this is actually my first time working this way. I typically don't work this way. I typically would block the characters out with darks and then slowly reveal the light and build up form. But this way was kind of an interesting learning experience for me. This is not the way I typically like to work and render. And some of the shortcomings it had was just there was a lot of harsh edges everywhere that I had to get rid of that felt kind of tedious, versus had I done it the way I typically do it, a lot of that would have been taken care of as I had done the rendering. And then I'm going to color the value sketch with gradient maps, which is another uncommon way that I work. It's not often that I work this way. And pros and cons for working this way. One of the pros about working with gradient maps is you get kind of a range of color within a certain color. So for example, in that black that I put on Shadow, instead of it just being gray, there's kind of a slight blue tint to him. And also in his red, there's kind of a pinkish tone to it, which is something that you could do manually, but it just happens in gradient maps. The downside of this workflow is you actually kind of have less control over the way light interacts with forms. And what I mean by that is, like, once the gradient map is on the character, I can add light on top of it. But if I had just done all the color manually, either on hard light layers, overlay layers, multiply, whatever, I would have a lot more control over how all the surrounding light interacts with that color. And instead, I'm kind of locked into this gradient map look. Another thing that I didn't do that I typically do when working with gradient maps is merge all the layers down into a single layer. I'm going to zone in on Shadow and just really focus on making sure one character at a time looks as good as they possibly can. Jumping between characters is not something I like doing. I'd rather just focus on one at a time. Even if I bounce around between that character in different places, I'm just spending 5 to 6 hours on one character and then moving on when I think they're done. And so there's a lot of things still to solve here, but the main point of rendering in my brain, the way that I think about it, is just get rid of the line art. So if I can get rid of the line art and it reads well, then I've done my job. That's the point of a painting, is to eliminate the line art completely. So any scaffolding, any sort of reference you needed should be gone, and the painting should speak for itself. I'm referencing the artist Mitara on Twitter. I think this person really captures light and rendering for Sonic characters incredibly well, and I was really inspired by their work to kind of get something similar going with a piece of my own. This is definitely a very render intensive piece. It took a total of about 18 to 19 hours. Every minute that passes, 1 hour of real-time working has passed. Obviously, I've chopped this up quite a bit, but roughly this was about 18 to 20 hours of work. I didn't really think about his hand and how his hand interacted with everything. I have to paint a new hand on top of him and put the rings there and all that. So there are things that you can solve in the line art phase that will just make rendering so much easier. I'm painting still in black and white, but I have the colors activated, and I just have my color drop selected to select layer only. So that way I'm only picking up grays or values of gray. Even though it looks like I'm coloring in color, I'm not. I'm only coloring really in black and white. And then occasionally I'll throw layers on top of all the gradient maps to add additional ambient lighting or subsurface scattering on top of everything. So again, a lot of this is just render, render, render. For the majority of this, I was simply using just a round brush, soft brush, and hard round brush, and that was it. And then the blur tool. Nothing special, nothing crazy. And moving on to Rouge, something I realized I was gonna have to do is start picking apart characters and really separating them by shape. This becomes a huge part of Omega's painting process, but in Rouge, I started to do the same thing. So for example, I separate all the areas that are pink on her, and I just separate them and I keep those shapes really clean and really sharp. You can just make a lasso selection on your gray layer and then just copy it and paste it right on top. And that basically, you know, saves that silhouette and keeps it nice and sharp. Because a lot of rendering is about edge control, and the easiest way to maintain an edge is to just create a new layer. That's the easiest way. So if you ever want to have more control over your painting, you just add more layers. I'm just working in black and white still. I'm not completely satisfied with her value sketch, with her value painting. So I'm gonna put in more detail for her before I start adding gradient maps on top. The more time you put in here, the bigger payoff there is, because this is effectively the entire rendering job is just black and white value sketching, and then you just add gradient maps on top, and then some additional lighting, you know, ambient lighting, rim lighting, all that stuff. I just throw gradient map on the whole thing, and then I can lasso select and mask out the areas that aren't needed. There was no gradient map for her white, for any part of her that was white. I just added a soft light layer and painted some blue in those areas. So her head and her gloves were just kind of lit by ambient light, sort of. But you can see I'm using kind of a strategy here, which is I'm taking distinct pieces of Rouge that I think need really sharp edges, like for example, her chest piece, and then creating really distinct shapes out of it and separating it so that way it maintains a sharp look and maintains its silhouette. So you can see that her chest piece, the hearts on her boots, and the pink, anything that's pink on her right now is a totally separate object on top of the existing black and white grayscale rendered layer. I thought it'd be fun to paint like a subsurface scattering on her wings to really add that realism, make her feel like she's a real bat, and then the light is coming through her wings and actually illuminating the blood vessels beneath it. This is not my typical workflow. I tend to like to work in grayscale and add hard light layers on top, because hard light really helps punch those colors up, punch those values up, and then I solidify everything to a single layer and just paint on top of it. That's how a lot of my work is done, at least my personal work. So this was a different way to work, and I'm not sure I really liked it. And I honestly felt like I was fighting the process more than enjoying it. So I probably won't work like this in the future, honestly. But it was still a fun thing, a fun exercise to do, and I'm happy with the results. I think it came out pretty well. I'm happy to have this piece done. I mean, it was, again, sitting on my iPad for years, so it's kind of nice to just have that done and not worried about it anymore. Right, so it's at this point that I'm working on Omega, and again, he required a lot of layers, because I basically separated every single part of him into a distinct layer to really make sure his shapes were properly in perspective, but also maintained a clarity and a sharpness to them. And so again, the easiest way to maintain clarity, sharpness, and an edge is to just use separate layers. And so by properly layering things, making the right selections, and just taking a little bit more time to set up my layers, I can keep his shapes totally distinct and nice and legible. And so every part of him is built into sections, into pieces. His eyes were like 10 layers, you know, even his arms and his hands, everything just was layers, layers, layers. And that just allowed me to paint one thing at a time. It kind of felt like my airbrushing technique a little bit, at least for him. Like, it was just very technical, a lot of pen tool, a lot of just making selections. But I think the results speak for themselves, that putting in this extra effort and this extra work just really helps with this sort of hard surface blocky character. And knowing how to paint metallic things, I mean, it's just a matter of time. It's a matter of practice, you know, but I mean, for the most part, creating a highlight in one area and then right next to it, putting a contrasting value, you know, a dark, and then maybe a mid-tone again, then a dark again, then another light. I mean, you can kind of do this. You can kind of cheat metallic looks pretty easily once you know the like rhythm of the values. The downfall of working this way is that modifying things or finding things in your layer stack becomes just kind of a pain in the butt. You don't know where everything is all the time because there's so many different layers. I think the end result speaks for itself. So again, he's all in black and white, but now I'm setting up a bunch of gradient map layers, which just requires very specific selections. But because everything is in layers, I can actually just select and deselect from other layers and basically isolate very specific parts of Omega based on just selections alone. Shape separation construction is based off vector layers that I use the ellipse tool, the line tool, and then I make a general selection out of that, fill it, and then create a mask out of that filled silhouette. And if you ever want to see the full unedited time lapse of this, it's available for any subscriber to the channel. So if you join the Lizard Legion for $2.99 a month, you'll be able to watch this unedited, well, slightly edited, but not sped up version, and you'll be able to track what I'm doing. The key to rendering any piece is just patience. I've gone over this multiple times. I get bored pretty often when rendering. I put on a podcast or I look around the picture to go and jump to different pieces of the character to render. But ultimately, it's in my head that I just want it to look as good as possible, and I don't really stop until I think it's done. And what is done for you may be different than for me, depending on your skill level. As you build up your skill level, you're going to set that threshold higher and higher. So for example, if right now the thought of painting something for 6 hours straight is daunting, you should start with something that's 2 hours or 1 hour. You'll effectively build up a tolerance, and with your tolerance will come a work ethic, and your work ethic will determine your quality. So if you are willing to put in more time into something, it will just end up looking better. Just the more time you spend on a painting, it will just look better. So now I'm creating this belt around him. It looks like a contraption, but I basically separated each little chunk out, and that allowed me to have a lot more control over this belt piece, and I think it was for the best. I think the end result of Omega I'm actually pretty satisfied with. It did require a bit of work, and now I'm extending out his back here because I realized that proportionally, looking at a different angle of him from some other heroes artwork, was just, he's not on model, so I had to extend his sort of chest plate out a bit. If you guys have any more questions about my workflow, leave them in the comments. Can you render something to death? Yes, you can render something to death, but you should learn how to do that. It's a skill to actually learn how to render something to death. And then it's a skill to learn how to hold back and simplify things and not render so much. I always think it's very helpful and demystifying to see an artist work out their process in real time. It's sort of, seeing how the sausage is made is actually kind of important, because even if the art is good, you want to see what was the actual thought process behind getting to that point. How did they end up with that picture? And so I always think it's helpful to just fully see what an artist is doing and just peel back the curtain, which is part of the reason I like live streaming a lot. The parts that are metallic don't actually have a gradient map attached to them. They're still just regular grayscale. And then on top of it, I'm just adding a slight blue hue, adding some ambient light manually on top of the gradient map. And if I ever need to break the silhouette of Omega, for example, I can just add a layer on top and basically paste things on top of the existing silhouette. So I'm not totally beholden to the silhouette. So like these little diamonds on his hands, I just created a new layer on top. Same thing with the fingers. It was just easier to add the fingers totally below him and then on top of him, and then just mask out the areas that didn't need to be there. Now I'm adding all the decals. They're just on a separate layer on top and kind of manually shading them in, adding some nice gloss and reflective layers on top. Now I'm going to add some layers of separation by adding a green highlight, kind of indicating that it's coming from Omega. It's a little exaggerated, but I think it just helps separate the characters a bit more and add some spice. Adding some reflections from Rouge on Omega, implying that he's, really glossy and metallic. I didn't really add any scratches or any dents to him or anything. I just wanted to keep the rendering nice and clean. Keep the background nice and simple. I mean, this is a character portrait, so I wanted the background to really highlight them and complement their existing color scheme. So I felt like a cool background would match the ambient light that I gave them and also just help them pop since they're a much warmer color palette. It was at this point
the creature thought he was done with the painting. But when he sent it in for review, he didn't realize the reviewer was Larry.
So after talking to Connor, he gave me some suggestions and that lit up my own brain to make Omega's hand into a gun. And he suggested giving Rouge an emerald and then also adding some light under Shadow's feet. So I go and make those adjustments. That was an extra, 3 or 4 hours of work to give Rouge a new hand and build a new gun and all that. I also decided to give her nails, which was an upgrade in Sonic Adventure 2. And I honestly just thought it would look nice. No one really likes this change, but that's okay. I stuck with it. I liked it. I think it adds a nice little pop to her hands and definitely makes her look more bat-like and kind of just a lot more, femme fatale. And before I do anything, I duplicate Rouge's layer so that way I just have the original as a backup. And this hand is sort of an alt that sits on top of it. Decided to go with a purple emerald because I thought that would be just a nice complement to the color scheme that she has, and it wouldn't stand out too much. I didn't want it distracting. Adding some ambient light coming from the emerald, like it's giving off a nice little glow. Make her shoe a bit bigger. Yeah, these are all just kind of final touches. Going around polishing up areas where I need to, making sure characters stand out and read appropriately, that they can just be separated from each other. Again, more construction, just vector layers and then selections and carefully creating nice silhouettes and then painting inside the silhouettes. And I'm not using any reference for the metal. I've painted metal quite a few times. And again, you can kind of cheat the look once you know the rhythm of the values in metal. Add some nice little gun smoke to it. He just fired it. And then using a glow dodge layer, I'm going to go in and heat up those ends of his gun to make it look like a, recently fired. And then for the sort of cherry on top, I add a little subtle film grain onto it and some chromatic aberration, which are available in Clipsio Paint 3.0. And with that, that's the end of the Team Dark time lapse. Thanks for watching. Subscribe, like, consider becoming a member. Until next time, make good art.